On behalf of the Council on Library and Information Resources and the Digital Library Federation, welcome to today's supplemental session to the June 11th webinar on digital repositories. Our guest speaker today is Nancy McGovern. Nancy serves as Head of Curation and Preservation Services at MIT Libraries. Nancy will be speaking with us today on repository self-assessment and audit options. Nancy, it's my pleasure to join you today, and when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rita. It is a pleasure to be here today, kind of act two on this presentation, and without further ado, let's get going. So I wanted to talk today about some things to do with organizations that engage in digital content management need to also think about their options and their process for doing self-assessment and audit. In the digital world especially, but probably also in the physical, but in the digital, there's an absolute expectation that it's a show me, not trust me model. So you must be able to figure out how to demonstrate good practice to any stakeholders, whether they're local or beyond. Increasingly, the digital preservation community has an expectation that you will be able to demonstrate that you're meeting certain requirements, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Part of the reason to talk about the tool towards the end of this, the track review tool we call it, is that there's been a sense that organizations are going to have a real struggle in meeting these requirements. And in fact, they're quite doable if people approach it like they do anything else, with a project-based approach, a sensible timeline for tackling the various parts of the process, not trying to drop everything and do it in a very short period of time, which really doesn't have a long-term impact on improving the overall practice at the organization. So that's the gist of what we're going to talk about today. And since about 2007, we've specifically had what is now the basis for an ISO standard, so TRAC, Trustworthy Repositories, Audit and Certification. I was one of a small group, I think there were about a dozen of us, who were involved in developing the TRAC requirements. It was an incredible process. I know I enjoyed it. I think most of us did. It resulted in the public document that became available in 2007, January. That formed the basis for a lot of other activities and is a kernel of work on demonstrating self-assessment and audit. Self-assessment and audit was called out in a standards-based way in the 1996 report, Preserving Digital Information. It specifically talks about the need to certify in the digital world. So we're carrying on from that. This is a growth of standards and practice in the community, which is really incredible to see in a fairly short period of time. So TRAC is the basis for the requirements that we now are kind of building on. We mentioned Nestor and Dini, the group in Germany that were very active. Nestor is a project that was part of the EU. It was based in Germany, and they developed a catalog for, it's a coaching style for helping smaller organizations achieve good practice in digital preservation. It really informed, it came together around the same time, same time frame as TRAC, so it really informed how people were looking at what we needed to do and how. So Nestor is the catalog. Dini is actually a repository certification process and group in Germany where digital repositories have been certified for some period of time. So it became kind of a model that we referred to in the TRAC group. Drambora is a group, is a tool, it's a group that came together to develop a tool that basically looks at risk management for digital content. It takes a risk management perspective of assessing what your content is. The reason they're listed together is that they came together and developed, based on Robin Dale, who convened the group right around January of 2007, brought these three groups together to sort of come up with a common set of principles that we'll look at in a little bit. If that hadn't happened at that moment in time, our community would have all different threads of certification and assessment going on. So the 10 principles provide a basis for these are some root things that people really, really need to do. Drambora is a tool that does a specific part of it. It is based on TRAC. And there's a real commonality between the Nestor catalog and the TRAC requirements. So these threads came together around then. It took about 5 years for a Birds of a Feather group working with CCSDS, the same group, the Space Data Group, that brought us the OAIS model. That group worked for 5 years in their standards development process. So taking the track document from 2007, transforming it into an ISO document. That's a really important process. It is really important for organizations to know that the requirements in 2007 were not fundamentally different at the end of the process. So the ISO 16363 is very, very similar to the requirements that came out in 2007. So we have a really firm base to build self-assessment and audit on. Okay, so why do we go about doing some of this? I mentioned the fact that it's really important to demonstrate good practice. So some of the benefits of self-assessment and audit for an organization that's managing digital content is a self-assessment process leads to a gap analysis. So it allows you to put a stake in the ground for this is where we are right now in a very honest way, not pretending to be doing better than you are, but really honestly saying, here's our strengths, here's our gaps. And then using the track requirements to say, this is where we want to get to, and how do we get from here to there? From the original group of track requirements development, we were not ever intending for this to be 100% like all or nothing kind of process, but something that incrementally allows people to improve practice because it's so important that they do. That they're addressing not a single batch of the requirements, but across the board making progress so that organizationally and technologically and financially they are able to demonstrate the good practice in all of these different areas. Using this guide, the track requirements as a guide. So it's a very important process to go through. It's very helpful. What we're hoping to do with the tool that I'll tell you about, the track review tool, is to make it possible for organizations to do this in a less painful way, so that they're able to actually embrace it as something that's just part of what they do in an ongoing way, incrementally, and everything that they do in digital content can get captured in some way and lead to sort of incremental progress. So it's a great way of going about it without it feeling like such a burden or a one-time thing. We plan. No, we engage in preservation planning. So these are some of the benefits. It allows the program to actually say they can be transparent about what they're doing, and that means that they be able to make the case for, here's our program, here's why it's good, here's why it should get more funding, here's why it should move in this direction. It's the basis for doing a sustainable digital curation and preservation program. So some of the things that come out of a track review, and I just refer to it generally as a track review. People now say things that are not sensible to me, like, are you doing track or ISO? For me, track review means that you're going through the requirements that we use the ISO version now, but it's basically a track review. You're trying to demonstrate good practice. So the kinds of things that result from that process, and we're seeing more and more organizations formally and informally go through such a process, self-assessment that leads to some kind of external audit. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But completing a track review, it leads to formalizing policies. When we did a track review of the archive preprint repository at Cornell, at that point, a number of the policies were really email exchanges between people. They weren't really captured in such a way that would be, the policies themselves need to be preserved. When you make a decision, you capture it so that in the future you can say, this is the basis for the actions that we took from that point on. So formalizing policy is essential. Who's on first for what kind of responsibility? So who's got what roles across the life cycle for managing digital content? This doesn't matter whether it's archival records, research data, whatever it is, it's necessary to say who is responsible for which parts. Primary responsibility and secondary responsibilities, but it's a very collaborative, shared responsibility within organizations, and it's important to know who's meant to do what things, both so that there's not too much overlap and there's not gaps between nobody doing something that should get done. It's a way of looking at succession planning, thinking about it and demonstrating it to the point that it's sensible. So if an organization would cease to do all or some portion of what it's been doing with digital content, it's a way of sort of suggesting, documenting possibilities for how succession planning might work. So for our ICPSR, we had, it's a social science data archive. We have partners, a set of partners through DataPass, an organization that's managing digital content in the social science realm. So those are obvious places where if ICPSR stopped, other people might pick up all or some of that. So things that the really important parts of what we do with digital content. Things about designated funding. So designated funding is something that's called out as part of what a trusted digital repository needs to be able to do. How am I going to try to fund my program over time? It doesn't mean here's my, my budget line that could maybe be, canceled out. It means come up with a compelling story, compelling case for how you're affording your program in a year-to-year basis, looking ahead to the extent that you can. Rationalizing metadata, again, going back to the archive preprint repository example, we really found that things like preservation rights, so the ability to copy content once you receive it, were not really addressed explicitly. So it calls out places where you might want to make things more explicit in your current process. It's an improvement process. It's an understanding where you are kind of process. So. And then all those things cumulatively, when you do a self-assessment, allow you to prioritize what technical developments are most important, whether you do them in-house or whether you go to a service provider. However you do it, there's like bang for your buck. This kind of thing right here, this addressing this requirement would do a lot for all these other things that are related to it. So it's a way of investing sensibly and efficiently and effectively in the kinds of activities that you need to do. You may have to do this thing before you can do that thing, like make sure your storage management is all set before you go on and take on new kinds of content, for instance. And what the track process is meant to help you do is to better understand where you are in relation to the community at large, but also where you are now as opposed to where you might be in 2, 3, 5 years from now. Okay, so these are the 10 principles that I mentioned. This is the group that came together, TRAC, Drambora, and Nestor. These are crucial moments in our community's development where it could have really splintered and it could have gone in a lot of different directions. The fact that those 3 groups came together and came up with 10 principles, that's something that has power for communicating within your organization and beyond. It is in one place, and these are not burdensome, and individually they make a lot of sense. Commits to continuing maintenance of digital objects for identified communities. They are all founded in the full set of trusted digital repositories and OIS and the track requirements, but they've been boiled up into a set of requirements, a set of principles that people can really address. So there's a lot of, this is not a new thread. The need to demonstrate good practice through self-assessment and audit is not a new thread in our community, but now that we've gone through the process of acknowledging that it has to happen in 1996, that report explicitly calling out certification has to happen. Not the first time it was said, but the first time it came together in that community document. The iterative actions after that, OIS reference model calls out the need for certification. It lists it as one of the associated standards that really needs to be put into place. Community groups get together, track requirements, other things that go around that, including Drambora and Nestor, and other things. And now we can go, and tools are increasingly incorporating these kind of requirements and responding to them into the workflows that we're able to use. And we'll come to that in a bit too. So this is an important set of principles that if you haven't really just had a group in your organization go to and review, this is a group to just wrap your head around and say, we're going to adopt these as principles that make sense for us. It's also a really powerful tool for talking to people who might not need to be as familiar with digital curation and preservation as we might need to be. It's a very simple set of principles. So I mentioned Platter because this is one of the examples of, this came out of the Planets Project, which was a European Union, EU project that is now turned into the Open Planets Foundation. So as one of the outcomes of that is they went through an analysis, they took the 10 principles, what we just looked at, the corresponding core principles numbered in the far column, and they looked at what kinds of documents would be useful and would correspond to those principles. What would you have to demonstrate one or more of the principles? So now it's a long list of things that we really don't have standards yet for. We don't really have what does a business plan, a staffing plan, and so on look like for all of these. We have better examples, better and better examples of what these things would look like. But if you were to have some version of these things, it would populate all of the principles for sure, and basically form the foundation of documentation that you would need to have in place to demonstrate good practice through a track review. They cover a lot of ground. So this is a way of crystallizing, like, here's the stuff, this is action that if you can produce some version of these, and the documents themselves are incremental. You start off with a draft. Getting to a draft is one of the hardest things organizations can do. The difference between not having documentation and having documentation is huge. From that point forward, once you have the baseline, once you have a document, once you have one version, one complete version of your track review in place, it puts you in really good shape to proceed from there. It also gives you a comparison point. So the iterations of your documentation are the records of your good practice. You build them and you keep them and you manage them over time. I know it sounds fun, doesn't it? Okay, so the track review in Drupal. So we go from organizations are required to do these things. This process comes out of the Digital Preservation Management Workshop that I've been leading since about 2003. It's that every time we identify some requirement that an organization needs to meet, we try really hard to come up with a model document or some kind of process that makes it possible for organizations to address those things without having to invent them entirely themselves. So the first version was when I was working at University of Michigan, ICPSR, and it used the 2007 version of the track requirements, but it used Drupal. Drupal is an open source tool. Most places have some kind of local support for it, or at least somebody who is pretty familiar with it. It's a very simple instance of Drupal, so it should be very supportable. We wanted to make it possible for, the purpose of the track review tool is to make it possible for somebody to start without having to figure out how they're going to track, how they're going to do the various parts of it. They can adapt the tool in any way they want, but everybody can have a common starting point, which is here's the track review and it's populated in these ways. Okay. Second version came out not long after I got to MIT Libraries, and it incorporates the ISO version, 16363 version of the requirements, and maps it back to the 2007 track requirements. You'll notice that there are some slides on the Curate Gear from January 2014. I have the 2013 link here because I noticed that the link actually goes to John Crabtree's slides from January. So I'm working on getting that updated, but it's just another example of kind of link rot, link migration. But so you know, there's information around there. The other thing that's here is a download from the Artifactual site. So Artifactual, that is responsible for Archivematica, for Atom, they are doing a great job of working with us on this whole process of internal audit and how do we go about it, because they've been asked to work with repositories. In trying to figure out using Archivematica, a lot of these questions come up, and so Courtney Muma is one. We've been kind of partnered on this, and she's worked through 3 repositories now to kind of walk through the process, and she's used the tool, and so we've gone back and forth about how to further develop it. We don't have support for it. Archivematica is basically providing it from the Artifactual site. You can download it. It's a complete instance. It's a standalone instance of Drupal that has all the content you need to do a track review. It's pretty neat. Not very complicated, pretty neat. Okay, this is what it looks like. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it came to be. So it allows an organization, as I said, to accumulate the results. It's not that you take 60 hours and you knock yourself out and you don't do anything else. You start at a certain point, maybe you pick Section 3, the organizational infrastructure part of the ISO 16363 requirements, and you start working your way through and saying, do we have anything that would suggest that this is something that we're doing right now? So it shows you that for each of the elements, sub-elements and sub-sub-elements, because ISO version of track introduced those sub-elements. We had only requirements before, now we have requirements and then sub and sub-sub requirements. So we just did one per. So organizational infrastructure tells you how many requirements, and then it keeps a cumulative thing running as you go through the process of entering your evidence and saying, here's my evidence to say that I am addressing this requirement. It keeps track for you. It also gives you a chance. So it allows you to treat it like a project, an ongoing iterative project. You can say, all right, for the next quarter, we're going to be doing this section right here. It's a way to parcel out the process so that different people can work on it across an organization. So on this top page, the requirement status, this is one long page in the front. It gives you introductory information about this is a track review tool, and this is how it helps you to go through your process in your organization. It has this section where the status summary, where it keeps track for you and shows you what your currently how you're doing. And then the requirement status below is one long list of all the requirements. And you can see what I was talking about. 3.12 is Preservation Strategic Plan, and under that there's 2 sub-elements. So some of them actually go to sub-elements. Okay, so the next to that you see compliance rating. Compliance rating is you decide how your evidence allows you to be demonstrating that you are fully compliant down to not compliant at all. Based on, like, you can show people, I have a mission statement, I don't have a mission statement. It does address the long term, it does not. So the other part, the status, allows you to treat it like a project. It allows you to really go through and say, what's, we're 80% done now, and you can see here, and you can, keep people up to date. You can manage it inside your project. So it's been accepted for review. So somebody in your organization beyond the group should be saying, okay, yes, we've accepted that this is a set of evidence in relation to track that our organization is willing to stand behind. Figuring out who that group would be, who would approve that, or who would say, yep, that's good, we're done with that particular requirement, the evidence for that requirement. Ready for review means your group is done. In progress means you're working on it, and not started is what happens, until you get going on each requirement, it's simply not started. So that's one way of managing what you're doing. Another way of doing it is we added in the notion that this distributed responsibility. So this is a set of general kinds of responsibilities within an organization. The 2007 version that we did at ICPSR, they were specific to ICPSR, so the roles were they were named by the group names that we had there. When we did the new version, version 2 of the track tool, using the ISO version, we also normalized these roles to sort of identify what we hope, and so far it has proven to be a generic set of responsibilities that you should or would find in an organization. There is senior management. The distinction between coordination and operation, coordination is the planning group, the planning to implement the organizing, decision-making, sort of, sending things up for approval by senior management and sending things down to just be done. The operations group is the day-to-day get on with it. Coordinations and operations can be confusing because sometimes it's the same people playing different roles, but distinguishing between planning to do and doing is particularly important in self-assessment, in demonstrating good practice. You want to make sure that you are not just planning to do something, that you're actually demonstrating that you are doing it. Information technology is another area. It takes many forms. It might be right in your organization. You might contract to get support and services. There's a whole section in section 3 of the track requirements, the ISO requirements, that address things like finance or human resources, things to do with staffing plans, for instance. So there's there are roles within the administration portion of your organization. And your organization means your local organization, your parent organization, depending on how, part of the process is getting to know your organization and who has these roles and how do you find them. So it's a really good process for understanding the organizational setting in which you're working. And that enables you to actually progress more quickly than you might otherwise. It's not unlike the eScience Institute phase 1, the course people went through. The Institute was all about trying to kind of parse out, get to know your organization, put the pieces together, and document where you are right now so that you can demonstrate progress. Very similar in many ways. So acquisitions, how do we bring things in? What is in scope for our digital archives, for our repository? Really important roles over there about in scope and out of scope. Preservation, of course. I tend to be involved with just about all of the requirements. Responsible for some, we'll get to that, and accountable for others. Dissemination, how to then, a whole part of track is that you're managing content over time. It's long-term access. It's that you're able to provide a strategy for providing digital content, not only now, but over time into the future. Rights management across the life cycle, not only copyright, but preservation rights, intellectual property rights, all different kinds of things that come up. Of life cycle management, metadata very often, rights are often captured in terms of metadata, but a group that is responsible for organizing that. We have one here called the Rights Assessment Group. And external advisory group, so somebody who might sign off on things. At ICPSR, we had a council that met 3 times a year, and one of the responsibilities was to sign off on high-level policies, so they would have certain kinds of roles in this. Next to that, you see senior management as an example, and the responsible, accountable, supported, consulted, and informed. We've adopted in the track review tool a project management approach called RACI. And there's more information, there's links and things in the tool itself, but basically instead of having it just be on, off, you're responsible or you're not, it kind of really calls out the various kinds of roles. So as I mentioned, so preservation, I'm responsible for many of the requirements. And those that I'm not, I'm accountable for making sure that we capture the evidence, that we're demonstrating good practice still. Support means somebody who helps to do it, like somebody has information that might be useful, somebody that has to kind of be part of the picture to produce the evidence, to document the evidence. Consulted means they might have information, you might want to work with them, get some kind of feedback with them, they would want to be in some way involved. It's a little bit more active than informed, but informed in this case is not a passive role. It's a group that might, like rights management might be responsible for certain kind of things and informed about a whole bunch of other ones because they would want to know what the nature of evidence expected, how does that relate to them. So informed means actively knowing about something. It's worked really well in the places that we've tried this. So ICPSR went through a process. We're going to start one here at MIT Libraries in the not too distant future. And as I mentioned, Courtney Mooman's used it for 3 different repositories. And other people are telling us that they're downloading it and they're starting to use it. So we're getting, the more in our community, because it's applied, the more that we have examples where people can go and say, how did somebody do this? The better off we'll be in moving towards a situation where we might go to some kind of external audit certification process. But we're jumping the gun on that. So here we go. So what are the roles? This is all incorporated into the tool. So there's an option for, this is the explanation of what the responsibilities look like, who does it, information about this. It's just a way of parsing out if you just look at track, it looks really daunting. If you parse it out and you frame it out over some period of time that makes sense for your organization, then it's a much more doable thing. And the result is that your organization increases incrementally the things that it expands what it can do in terms of long-term digital content management, including research data. Okay, so some of the new features, I told you, what we were trying to do with it, but in this most recent version, I mentioned all of the content from ISO 16363 was incorporated, which is really great. It's all right there, all the content. Initially, we had just the requirements, and we added in the kind of contextual information from the document. So people can really start from stand up a version of the track review tool and get going. They don't have to go back and forth unless they choose to. The incremental and cumulative ratings, in version 1 of the tool, you needed a calculator to figure out what your current rate was. So the fact, it's a small step, but it gives people an idea of where they are. Though it's against the whole of the number of requirements. So until you get your baseline done and you have some sense of where you are in each of the requirements, it won't give you a good idea of where you are. Courtney and I, going back and forth, both realized that having a natural language question field would be really helpful. And this is because if you go out to do a track review and you start talking to people, if you ask them a question, it's much more possible for them to give you the information they may have than if you just say, here's a requirement, how do you address it? But if you say, look at this requirement, then they're challenged by it, they don't really know what that means. But if you say, do we have a mission statement that addresses the long-term preservation of the content that we have? And there's a yes, no, I don't know. If it's I don't know, it's a good thing to track and sort of go and look at. So the natural language field allows anybody to enter in a question that makes sense. It might include local acronyms. It allows it to sort of be a much more doable for the people who have the information to respond, making it as easy as possible for the organization to get started and keep going on the self-assessment process. We also added in the staff-only sections, which are action items. So if you say, well, no, we don't have a mission statement in, then the action item would be develop a mission statement. And the notes might be anything to do with that. And those are in the access controls set up in the Drupal tool. Those are set up to be, whoever has a login can see them, but otherwise they're not viewable by the public. Otherwise it's set to, people can follow along as you're doing your track review. Now the thing about that is Drupal allows you, once you have your instance locally, you can adjust it any way you want to. You can set up whatever access. You can keep it entirely local until you're ready to make whatever portion of it you want to available. We also added in an audit role. This has to do with some peer review audit work that a number of us have been working on. I'm specifically working with the National Digital Stewardship Alliance Standards Group. We've been mostly focused on getting the tool, so that it's downloadable, and that's happened. But we're trying to do some guidance on what would a peer review audit look like, so that you identify maybe 4 or 5 organizations that are either near you or like you or willing to kind of engage with you in a process of self-assessment. You do self-assessment and then they review that and they help you kind of improve. They help you identify, verify that what the documentation you've provided is sufficient. We're thinking that as a step towards whatever future certification, more formal external audit that people go through, there are a couple of options that have been emerging, but this is a step from we're not doing much of anything to we're actually engaging with people we identify as peers in a process that they also have to go through. So it doesn't, and it's a kind of creating a level playing field. Everybody has the same obligation. If we get into it together, it's doable and it's more fun, frankly. So the audit role is you get to a certain point in your self-assessment process. You kind of freeze your track review version right then. Where are you with your self-assessment? And you turn it over to someone that you identify as an auditor, somebody who can help you to improve. Not to chastise you for what you haven't done yet, but to really sort of come up with some suggestions of, yes, that makes sense. I don't understand what the evidence means in this case. Any way that would allow you to improve your documentation and improve your kind of track record for what you're doing so far. Okay. What I did want to do is see if I can share my screen so I can show you the tool. If it doesn't work, we'll see how that works, and we'll get on with it. So, Is that going to work, Rita? There we go.
There you go.
Yep, it sent me. Okay, are you seeing it? Okay, so you should be seeing a track review process and progress screen. This is what the tool looks like, the full page. So you've seen some of the screenshots. And this is a whole list by section and how it looks. Now what you're seeing over there in the in progress is actually one of the things that Archivematica has done. Courtney went through and she actually indicated the ways in which Archivematica addresses the track review requirements, which I think is great. It's one, and she's actually put out a call to other developers to say, if we do this cumulatively, like if everybody were to go in and say, these are the requirements that I address and track. My part of the workflow does this, my tool does that. If we had that for all the various providers that we either use or that are available in the community, then it would really help people do their self-assessment. Because one of the things we know about self-assessment is that we need to partner with providers to be able to meet the storage management requirements, archival storage, to do these things together. No single organization is going to be doing this entirely on their own. So this is just an example of what this looks like, the things that we just looked at. Okay, so here's a whole page for, like, what does this look in? Oh, let me see if I can do my login. Thought I was already logged in. Boo, boo, boo. This doesn't work, we might be done. All right, there we go. So back to home, and let me get back to where I was. I'm just going to call it, this is a fairly straightforward one. So I'm going to pull up this and show you behind the scenes. This is the, we came up with a nickname for each requirement so that it can show up on the page without this long text. So we just came up with a nickname, mission statement in this case. This is actually the requirement text. It's the text directly from ISO 16363 that says, what is the organization meant to do? Oh, that's the supporting text, sorry. And then we go down, and here we go. This is mission statement. So there we go. We have this. Do we have a mission statement is the question. That's a natural language question I was telling you about. Create the mission statement and who should do that. So this is behind the scenes. You're able to say who's responsible, who's accountable, how do we go about figuring out this. It allows you to track. You enter in all of your information. So in this case, you'd say, what's the URL for the mission statement? Where would I find it? Okay, so if I go back to the view, then you can see over here. So here's the whole of the requirement, the supporting text. Examples were called out for each of the requirements in both the 2007 track, and it was really beat up on and during the ISO process, and expanded to make sure that it included as many contexts as possible. And then a discussion, which is helpful in having people figure out how to go about it. One of the things about Drambora is that it actually really informed the process by saying, making it clear that evidence was required. And early on in the track requirements development, it wasn't explicitly called out as that, but Drambora really contributed the fact that we need to have explicit evidence that says this is how we're meeting this requirement. We also need to have metrics. How do we figure out what fully compliant is? And we're getting there. We're trying to get to the more examples we have, the more kind of we can say, in this kind of situation, this is what your evidence should look like, the more easy it will be for organizations to tackle this, to kind of take on their obligation, and this is what I want to be able to demonstrate to people. So if we go back to home, if we look at responsibilities for track, so anytime we want to, we can, if we decide to assign the roles and responsibilities, we say, right, senior management is accountable for these things and responsible for these other things. And if they go to their page, this is another way in which you can use it in a kind of project management way. They can see right away that which things are theirs, and they can follow along. And so the tool is all about trying to make it easy and visible for people, that they can share the results incrementally as they go along, internally and externally, as they choose. They can just make it into a function, a process that they're working on. Let me just show you. This is an example of, I mentioned Courtney went through and identified ways in which Archivematica helps. So Archivematica manages PDI, preservation description information, using premise and METS XML as part of the AIP, and then it points to a URL. This is very typical of the kind of evidence that you would provide. Very often for an organization, you would date that. You would say, I entered that, or the department, something that would age well with the evidence. So in 5 or 10 years, how can you identify who said what about the evidence? But it's whenever you put in the evidence, you say, this is the date I did that on. What that gives you is a running list of how you have progressed with each of the requirements. So that is the end of the discussion about this. It'd be nice if we could do question and answer periods, but there we go. Thank you very much for having me today, by the way.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for your time today and for your very thorough discussion of track and other audit options. I'm hopeful that the group will really appreciate your talk. It was a pleasure being with you today, and thank you again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.